My daughter-in-law's mother put her out at 5:40 in the morning, and the only reason I know the exact minute is that I was the one who got the phone call, standing in my kitchen in my socks, coffee not even poured yet. She was standing on the sidewalk in her nightgown and a coat that wasn't buttoned right, holding my grandson, who was 2, half asleep and confused, his little arms locked around her neck like he already understood something was wrong, even if he didn't have the words for it. Her sister's old suitcase was on the pavement beside her, the zipper broken on one end, held shut with a belt. That suitcase held whatever she'd managed to grab in the 4 minutes they'd given her. She didn't cry when she called me. That's the part that still sits wrong in my chest. She just said, "Dad, can you come get us?" in a voice so flat and careful it scared me more than screaming would have. My son wasn't answering his phone. I found out why soon enough. She didn't know I'd already been waiting for a morning like this one for the better part of a year. Didn't know that in the drawer of my desk at home, under a stack of old tax returns nobody would ever think to look through, there was a folder 2 inches thick with her mother-in-law's name at the top of it. And she had no idea, not yet, that the woman who just put her and my grandson out onto a public street in her bathrobe had made the worst mistake of her long, comfortable, untouchable life. Because behind the door that had just locked in my daughter-in-law's face was a secret that would have ended that woman's reputation the day it came out. I'd been sitting on it for 11 months. I'd been waiting for the right morning to use it. This turned out to be that morning. Let me back up, because you deserve to know how a family gets to a place like this one sidewalk at a time. My name is Grady Holt. I'm 66. I spent 31 years running the parts counter, and then the whole floor at a farm equipment dealership outside Lubbock, Texas, before I retired. My wife Ruth Ann passed 4 years ago, breast cancer, and I raised our son Micah, mostly alone for the last stretch of his growing up. Because that's how it works. Sometimes you bury your person, and you keep getting up in the morning because somebody still needs breakfast. Micah's a good man, quiet like his mother was. He manages a hardware store, the kind with the creaky wood floor and a guy behind the counter who actually knows what a flange is. He married a woman named Renata, and I want you to hear this and hold on to it, because it matters for everything that comes after. Renata is not the problem in this story. She never was. Keep her separate in your mind from what her family did to her, because she paid for their sins worse than anybody. Renata's mother is a woman named Corinne Ashfield. If you've ever driven through the nicer part of Lubbock, you've seen her name on a plaque somewhere. She owns 3 assisted living facilities and a chain of medical billing offices, and she sits on enough charity boards that the local paper runs her photograph twice a year in a nice dress, smiling next to somebody important. She built all of it herself after her husband left her with nothing. And I want to be fair to her for one sentence, because it's true. That kind of grit deserves respect. What she did with it later does not. I met Corinne for the first time at a Sunday dinner Micah threw together the year they got engaged. She walked into my house, and I watched her eyes move across my furniture the way you'd walk a used car lot, pricing everything without meaning to say a word about it. She told me my chili was rustic. She said it kindly. She said it like she was being generous. I've been called worse things, but I've rarely been complimented in a way that stung quite so precisely. I said nothing. You don't get to insult a woman's cooking with a compliment and have me make a scene about it at my own table on the night my boy's happy. But I filed it away. I've done that my whole life, filed things away in the back of my mind like paperwork, in case I ever needed to pull the folder again. They married the following spring at a country club Corinne belonged to, 200 and some guests, a band flown in from Austin. Corinne gave a toast that was, if you listened close, mostly about herself, about the family she'd built out of nothing, about the standards she expected her daughter to be treated by from here on out. She said the word standards 3 separate times. Everyone clapped in the right places. Micah clapped too. I sat there turning that word over like a stone in my pocket the whole drive home. My grandson arrived 19 months into the marriage. 8 pounds, a full head of black hair, a set of lungs that could wake the whole ward. They named him Wyatt. Micah called me from the hospital hallway at 3 in the morning, and I heard something in my son's voice I hadn't heard since his mother was alive, something cracked open and brand new all at once. Dad, he's here. He's got my hands. Dad, he's got my exact hands. I drove out there in the dark and stood at that nursery window a long while, looking at a boy with my son's hands, and something in me settled the way it does when a thing finally makes sense. The trouble came slow, the way it always does. It doesn't walk in the front door with a name tag on. It arrives in little pieces you don't think to lay side by side until you're forced to. About 6 months into the marriage, Corinne offered Micah a job not fixing anything, nothing to do with tools or a floor he actually understood. She wanted him running community outreach for her assisted living company, which is a polished way of saying she wanted a likable young man with an honest face standing in front of families deciding where to put their aging parents. It's real money, Dad, Micah told me. Real money, and Renata thinks I should take it. I asked what he thought. He said he figured it'd be good for the family. I told him to take his time. I said nothing else. He took it 3 weeks later. I visited his new office once. Nice building, glass everywhere, his name on a little plaque by the door that had clearly been made by somebody who wasn't sure how long it would need to last. He wore a tie that didn't sit right on him yet. He was proud, and I was proud that he was proud. And underneath all of it, I felt something cold settle in my stomach. Because here's what 66 years teaches a man. When somebody powerful hands you something for free, they aren't giving you a gift. They're installing a lever, and one day they mean to pull it. It was my old friend Dutch who pointed me down the road I ended up walking. Dutch spent almost 30 years doing contract law before he retired 2 doors down from me. One evening on my back porch, I was just thinking out loud, not accusing anybody of anything, just turning the situation over. Dutch went quiet a long minute. Then he said, "Grady, did that boy of yours ever get an actual employment contract, or is he just showing up?" I didn't know. I called Micah that night, easy, like idle curiosity. There was no contract. He was paid through something called a Family Services LLC, classified so he wasn't technically an employee of Corinne's real companies at all. More flexible for tax purposes, Corinne had told him. Dutch looked at me over his coffee the next morning and didn't say a word. He didn't need to. That was the morning I started keeping real notes in a spiral notebook I bought specifically for the purpose. I want to stop and talk to you plain for a second, the way I'd talk to a brother or an old friend across a fence line, because I think some of you already know this feeling from the inside. If you've ever watched someone you love walk smiling into a trap and known that saying so out loud would only make them defend the person holding the door open, then you already understand the particular kind of lonely I'm describing. You see the whole shape of it. You can't say a word, so you carry it by yourself. I carried it for the better part of a year. 4 months into my notebook, Renata came to see me alone, which had never happened before, not once in 3 years of marriage. I made her tea. She sat at my kitchen table a long while before she said anything. "Grady," she finally said, "I need you to know, I love Micah. I love him more than anything I've ever loved." I told her I knew that, and I love Wyatt more than I knew it was possible to love anything. I knew that too. She looked down into her cup. My mother has ideas about how things should look, about what kind of life Wyatt should have. And sometimes her ideas and Micah's aren't the same ideas. I asked what kind of ideas. She looked up at me, and what I saw on her face was a woman standing at a fork in a road she never picked for herself and wasn't sure she was allowed to walk away from. She thinks Micah is a decent man. She just doesn't think he's... She stopped. "Doesn't think he's what?" I asked. She didn't answer. She finished her tea and left 20 minutes later, and she hugged me at the door longer than she ever had before or since. I stood in my kitchen after the door shut and didn't move for a long while. That night I called Dutch, and then I did something I never once imagined I'd do in my life. I hired a private investigator, a retired sheriff's deputy named Cole Ferris that Dutch vouched for personally. Quiet, patient, thorough man. I asked him to map out the actual financial structure between Corinne and my son. What Cole found went so far past anything I'd feared that I made him say it to me twice. The house Micah and Renata lived in, a 2-story brick place in a nice part of town I'd always assumed they'd bought together, was owned outright by a trust that Corinne controlled entirely. Micah's name wasn't on the deed. It never had been. Corinne had called it a wedding gift and simply never signed a single piece of paper making it true. The salary ran through that LLC, structured so Corinne could end the arrangement any day of the week with none of the protections a real job carries with it. And the postnuptial agreement, because there had been one, 6 months into the marriage, presented to Micah as just a formality for the family trust, which Micah's own attorney, a man Corinne had personally recommended, had called standard Dutch. Reading it 2 years later, called it one of the most one-sided documents he'd seen outside a courtroom. I read that agreement on a Tuesday at my own kitchen table. I read it twice. Then I sat back and thought about the word rustic for a long time. Now I have to tell you the part that changed everything for me. Not the house, not the money. The part that kept me up at night and turned everything I did from that point forward into something cold and exact and patient. In the course of his work, Cole talked to a home health aide who'd worked briefly for Corinne years back, before Renata and Micah ever married, back when Corinne was still raising Renata alone after her husband left. The aide had no loyalty left to protect, and no reason to keep quiet. She told Cole that Corinne had, more than once, over the years, said things in front of staff about wanting Renata to marry up properly this time, and that there had already been one engagement before Micah ended abruptly. To a young man from a wealthy family ended, the aide said, the exact same way. Locks changed. A sudden phone call. The young man's belongings mailed to him in a box. I sat with that for 3 days. 3 days doing nothing but holding it. Renata had lived through this exact thing once before Micah ever came into the picture, and I understood then, with a kind of cold clarity, that this wasn't a woman making one hard decision about her son-in-law. This was a pattern. A woman who had built her whole life around never letting her daughter make a choice that didn't ultimately serve her, and who had already proven she'd burn a young family down to the studs to correct a mistake she believed she'd made. I built a plan slowly, over the months that followed. I told Micah I wanted to get the family's medical history properly documented, blood types and the like, since his mother's cancer had taught me how much that kind of thing matters, and it'd mean a lot to include Wyatt's too. Make a little project of it, something to remember his grandmother by. Micah thought it was a fine idea. He had no notion that I was also quietly gathering something else copies, through Dutch, of the exact language in that postnuptial agreement, and Cole's full paper trail on the trust, the LLC, and the first young man Corinne had done this to years before, a man Cole eventually tracked down and spoke with directly. He was married now, out in Amarillo, doing fine and more than willing to swear to what had happened to him. I spent the next 7 months in slow, deliberate preparation. Dutch helped me find Micah a real attorney out of Dallas, a sharp, quiet woman named Priscilla Vance, with no ties whatsoever to Corinne's usual circle of lawyers. I paid the retainer myself, out of money Ruthann and I had put away over 30 years that I'd always privately meant for Micah anyway. We documented everything, the trust, the LLC, the postnuptial agreement, the pattern with the first fiancé, all of it laid against Texas family law and property law, line by line. I didn't tell Micah any of it. Not because I didn't trust him, because I did know him, and that's exactly why. He'd have confronted Corinne the same hour he found out. He'd have handed her every advantage in the process, and her lawyers, the same firm that had drafted that agreement, would have had a polished response ready before he even got home. I'd watched that woman operate for 3 years. She was never once caught without a prepared position. I needed her caught flat, with nothing rehearsed, for the very first time in her life. So I waited. And waiting, when you love somebody and you can already see the blade coming for them, might be the hardest kind of work there is. The morning came on a Tuesday in September. I was in my recliner with the news on low when my phone rang, and it was Renata, not Micah, and her voice was that flat, careful voice I'd never heard from her before. "Dad, can you come get us?" "Where's Micah?" I asked. "He's in the driveway. He won't leave without me, but he can't get back inside either." My mother had the locks changed on the house this morning while we were both still asleep. There was already a locksmith parked out front when Micah went to leave for work. Then she called and said the arrangement with the company wasn't, she used the word sustainable, wasn't sustainable anymore, effective immediately. "Is Wyatt with you?" "Yes. He's right here. He's fine. He's just confused. He doesn't understand why we're standing on the sidewalk in our..." Her voice cracked there, finally, just once. "Dad, why is this happening?" I closed my eyes for 2 full seconds. "You get in my truck when I get there," I told her. "Both of you. And, Renata, you call Priscilla Vance the second you're in that truck. Her number's already in your phone, under V. I put it there 4 months ago." A long silence on the line. "You knew," she said. "Get in the truck," I told her. "That's all that matters right now." I drove out there faster than I should have, and when I pulled up, there was my son standing in his own driveway in yesterday's clothes, and there was Renata on the curb, with Wyatt asleep against her shoulder, despite everything, and that broken suitcase held shut with a belt sitting beside her feet. Micah looked at me the way a man looks when he's run clean out of ideas. I didn't say much. I just opened the truck door and let them climb in, and I put my hand on the back of my son's neck the way I used to when he was small and scared of the dark, and I felt him shake, just once, under my palm. They sat at my kitchen table for a long while after we got back to my place. I put coffee down in front of both of them and let them be quiet as long as they needed to be. Then I sat down across from them, and I started at the beginning. I told them everything: the notebook, Cole's findings, the trust, the LLC, the postnuptial agreement, and exactly what it said, the first fiancé out in Amarillo, and what had happened to him. I laid the folders out, one at a time, and let them read every page. Renata's hands weren't steady by the time she got to the third folder. She kept saying quietly, "I didn't know. I swear to you both, I didn't know she'd done this before," and I told her I believed her, because I did. Micah didn't say much of anything for a long time. He just kept turning back to the first page, like he was hoping it would read different the second time through. Finally, he looked up at me. "How long have you known?" 11 months, I said. "And you didn't tell me?" "No." "Why?" "Because you'd have gone straight at her the same afternoon you found out of raw hurt instead of out of strength, and she'd have had a lawyer on the phone before you finished your sentence. I needed her caught with nothing rehearsed. This was the only way I knew how to do that for you." He sat with that a long time. Then he reached over and put his hand flat on the folder, like he was steadying it, or maybe steadying himself. "What do we do now?" he said. "We already started," I told him. Priscilla Vance filed the first documents that Friday. The core of it wasn't complicated, even though the work behind it hadn't been simple at all. The trust's failure to ever formally transfer the house, despite years of Corinne calling it a wedding gift in front of witnesses, created enforceable claims under Texas property law. The LLC pay structure, with no real contract behind it, gave Micah a strong case for owed compensation going back 3 years. And the postnuptial agreement, reviewed now by an attorney with no loyalty to Corinne's circle, had been signed under conditions that raised serious legal questions, especially once the pattern with the first fiancé came into the record as sworn testimony. Corinne's attorneys answered inside 2 days. They were sharp. They were fast. They'd clearly been braced for some version of a fight. What they hadn't braced for was the scope of what Cole had spent nearly a year building, quietly, one thread at a time. And then there was what Renata did, which I still think about more than almost anything else in this whole story. She didn't wait to be asked. She went to Priscilla's office on her own, without me, without Micah even knowing at first, and she handed over records of her own years of text messages, an old recorded voicemail from her mother about the first engagement, details about the trust that only a daughter would have access to. She sat in that office and told the whole truth about a mother who had never once let her make a single choice that didn't serve the family name. I don't know what it cost her to do that. I know exactly what it meant for my son and my grandson. Here's where I owe Corinne a moment of honesty, because I think it matters. I don't believe she woke up most mornings deciding to be cruel. I believe, in the deepest part of herself, she thought she was protecting something she'd built out of nothing after a man walked out on her with 2 kids and no money. She looked at my son, a decent, quiet hardware store manager with no head for business, and she saw a weak beam in a house she'd spent 30 years building with her own hands. She thought removing him quietly was kinder than a public fight. She thought she was being a good steward of everything she'd earned. That's the tragedy of people like Corinne. They confuse control for love so completely, for so many years, that by the time they're old they can't tell the two apart anymore, and everybody standing near them pays the cost of that confusion. Understanding that didn't make me forgive her, but it made what came next feel less like revenge to me and more like a building finally getting inspected by someone it couldn't scare off. The settlement took a little over 3 months. I won't lay out every piece of it, because some of it's still sealed and some of it just doesn't matter anymore. What matters is the outcome. The house was transferred into both their names, properly, on paper, this time. The compensation claim was settled, and Micah's finances were made whole and then some, legal costs included. The postnuptial agreement was thrown out entirely, ruled unenforceable. Corinne never saw the inside of a courtroom in handcuffs, and I want to be straight with you about that, because I know some of you reading this wanted that ending. What she did was careful enough to stay on the civil side of the law, and I'm not naive about what money and 30 years of careful reputation building can shield a person from. But word travels in a town the size of ours. Two of the families she'd been courting for a new assisted living contract quietly pulled their business once the court filings became public record. A development deal she'd been chasing for 2 years fell apart in financing within the month. Her name stopped opening doors it used to open without a second thought. I'll take that. I'll take every bit of that. This is the part where I tell you what all this taught me. Because I suspect some of you came here for more than just an ending. This whole thing taught me that the most dangerous people in a family rarely raise their voice. They give gifts. They build a cage one comfortable bar at a time, and by the time you notice you're standing inside it, the door's already shut behind you. The mistake most of us make is believing that love and generosity never come with a string attached. Sometimes they do, and the thing Renata understood, in the end, better than anyone else in that family ever managed to, is that protecting your own child sometimes means standing against the very person who raised you. So here's something you can do today, and I mean today, not someday. If somebody has given you a house, a job, a future, put your own name on the paperwork. Read the deed. Read every page of the contract before you sign it. Love and a signature are not the same thing, and the people who tell you not to worry about the difference are usually the ones counting on you never looking closely. And here's a question I'd like you to sit with after you're done here. If everything you have right now were quietly sitting in somebody else's name, how free do you actually think you'd be? Wyatt turned 3 in November. We had his little party right here at my place, because Micah and Renata are staying with me for now while they get back on their feet and figure out their next chapter. He wanted a cowboy theme, so I spent a Saturday afternoon letting a not-quite-3-year-old jam my old work hat down over my ears while I sat out on the back porch in the cold and told him I was the sheriff of the whole property. He thought that was about the funniest thing that had ever happened in the history of the world. Micah stood in the doorway watching the two of us, working through something that wasn't quite grief anymore, more like the slow, honest work of learning to trust a new shape for a family he thought he'd already understood completely. He's doing that work every day, honestly, without complaint. He drops Wyatt off at daycare in the mornings and reads to him every single night, and he hasn't missed a day since we got him out of that driveway. People sometimes ask me if I feel guilty for letting my son walk through those 11 months in the dark, not knowing what I knew. I don't have a clean answer for that. What I do know is if I'd told him the day I found out, he'd have gone at Corinne from raw hurt instead of from strength, and he'd have ended up alone in that fight with nowhere to stand. What I built took time and silence, and every bit of discipline I had in me to hold a plan steady while every instinct in my body was screaming at me to act right then. Was it the right call, keeping my own boy in the dark that long? I still don't rightly know. I know it was necessary. Before I let you go, I'd like to hear from you, because I read every single comment you leave me, and honestly, that's most of why I keep telling these. Tell me straight, do you think I did right, keeping quiet and building this in silence the way I did? Comment 1 if you think I made the right call protecting him without telling him. Comment 2 if you believe a father owes his son the truth the moment he learns it, whatever it costs. Comment 3 if you're somewhere in the middle on it, still turning it over the way I did for a year. And while you're down there, tell me whereabouts you're watching from tonight, and what time it is where you are. I like knowing how far these stories travel after dark. And if somebody with money or standing ever looked straight through you and decided your life was theirs to rearrange to suit them, tell me about it down there. You're not nearly as alone in that as it might feel some nights. If this one meant something to you, even just a little, do an old man a kindness and subscribe before you go. It's just me back here telling these, and a good number of folks who genuinely care about stories like this one, and every single one of you keeps this going. There's more coming. I'd like you here for it.